Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Please subscribe now to get the latest ancient history news and independent research from around the world. Around 12,000 years ago, as the last major ice age was reaching its end, the area between Britain and Europe looked very different compared to how it looks today. Instead of the North Sea, the area was a series of gently sloping hills, marshland, heavily wooded valleys and swampy lagoons. This area is known today as Doggerland. Doggerland was a populated region, and archaeologists say that hunter-gatherer communities fished, hunted and gathered food such as hazelnuts and berries. But over the millennia, as sea level rose with the ice sheets melting, together with the land flexing down due to isostatic rebound, Doggerland would begin to shrink before completely disappearing sometime between 3000 and 5000 BC, around the time when major Neolithic structures began to appear on the British landscape. Before its demise, and when the land was still populated, Doggerland also felt the full force of what some call a mega tsunami, triggered by the geological event known as the Storegga Slide. This underwater landslip that occurred around 6200 BC sent an almighty tsunami crashing into Doggerland, and even reached the coasts of Britain and mainland Europe, evidence of which is seen today in soil samples. It wasn't the end of Doggerland though, but for the humans living there, it may have marked the beginning of the end, and would have caused many people to leave the fertile lowlands and travel to higher, safer ground. We do know for a fact that people inhabited Doggerland, and the remains of a Stone Age culture do lie beneath the North Sea. Many people from this lost land must have ended up on the shores of Britain and Northern Europe, and as some estimate that Doggerland disappeared around 4000 BC, is it a coincidence that the British Neolithic began at the same time? Was Doggerland already a Neolithic farming society? Did they spread their knowledge to Britain as they settled in a new location, creating causewayed enclosures, henge and cursus monuments, as well as long barrows? Are these enigmatic ancient structures the memories of Doggerland? Some questions will never be answered, but the timeline of the decline of Doggerland and the rise of the British Neolithic does make me think that the two are interlinked. Yes, at the beginning of the Neolithic, people did travel north to Britain from mainland Europe, but we have no idea how many people travelled west from Doggerland. Doggerland is a lost landmass that is shrouded in mystery, but we are learning more and more about it all the time. It first came to light around a century and a half ago, when fishermen trawled the floor of the North Sea with weighted nets and discovered the remains of mammoths, aurochs, woolly rhinos and other extinct beasts. It was quickly apparent that the North Sea hadn't been a sea for very long. Many more finds came to light in the 20th century, including a harpoon that was carved from a deer antler. And in the 1980s, the first human remains were discovered, a well-preserved jawbone complete with worn molars, a find that was radiocarbon dated to 9,500 years ago. The story of Doggerland actually begins thousands of years earlier, when there was frozen tundra between Britain and Europe. For many tens of thousands of years, up to around 12,000 years ago, temperatures oscillated, ice sheets grew and withdrew, and nomadic hunter-gatherers followed wild horses, reindeer and woolly mammoths across the icy landscape. But inevitably, the Earth warmed up and Europe began to thaw, and as the ice receded, the biodiversity increased. Doggerland saw an influx of animals including deer, aurochs and wild boar as the once frozen tundra turned green. During the Mesolithic, wherever the animals went, humans were often not far behind, and moving from the uplands of what is now continental Europe, hordes of people discovered the vast low-lying plains of Doggerland. It was once thought to be an ancient, uninhabited zone, but archaeologists now know that it was in fact more like Europe's answer to the Garden of Eden, a post-Ice Age lush, fertile plain, and experts believe that the human population on Doggerland was significant. Due to its unique environment, it could well be the key to understanding the evolution of Europe during the Mesolithic. And, for me personally, in my research, I believe it's the key to understanding Europe's Mesolithic to Neolithic transition, something that I think could have first happened in Doggerland. Today we do have a good idea of what Doggerland looked like in post-Ice Age times, thanks to seismic surveys carried out by oil companies and the work of landscape archaeologists from the University of Birmingham. So far, around 18,000 square miles of submerged land has been digitally reconstructed. We have already learned so much, for example how the Rhine and the Thames actually joined up and flowed south. As Vince Gaffney from the University of Birmingham said about Doggerland, it was a paradise for hunter-gatherers, with its gently rolling hills, wooded valleys, lush marshes and lagoons. It is surely human nature to migrate and settle in such an environment, and that is why I believe that Doggerland could have actually been the first Neolithic society of Europe, because it did have the best resources for life to flourish and develop in Europe. Many talk of the location of Plato's lost sunken island of Atlantis, whether it is now lost under the Atlantic, the Mediterranean or even landlocked on a continent. But whether or not Atlantis existed, in my opinion, Doggerland should be more spoken about than Plato's Atlantis, because Doggerland is a real sunken landmass, a real lost land that was likely heavily populated. Regarding Atlantis, in my research I'm still somewhat on the fence as to whether or not it was real or mythical, but looking at the reconstructed landmass from Vince Gaffney et al., if you want a large circular feature surrounded by water, well, this salt dome could well fit Plato's words. I'm not saying it does specifically, but here we know we do have a huge landmass that is lost under the sea, and archaeologists have only just scratched the surface. There is so much lost and so much to discover. With the type of environment it was, I would think that the people living on Doggerland would have had to develop knowledge in water management. It was a wet and fertile landscape, and this ties in with my theory that the British Neolithic Henge and Curtis monuments were all created for water management purposes, to aid agriculture and animal husbandry, something I'll discuss at length in a future video. In my opinion, it's no coincidence that the greater cursus of the Stonehenge landscape crosses a stream, that the numerous Curtis monuments that are found at Rudston all cross or follow streams, how Avebury Henge would have been located at the head of the River Kennet in the Neolithic and so on. I have no doubt that the Avebury ditch was once a moat. I have a large amount of evidence and a belief that all of these British Neolithic structures were water related, and the technical know-how to create them must have come from somewhere. Cursus monuments in Britain were enormous construction projects at the beginning of the Neolithic, and we don't find equivalent structures in Europe. So, where did the idea behind them come from? There doesn't seem to be a gradual development in the British archaeological record, they just started appearing throughout the country, just as the Neolithic began. I propose that the ideas entered Britain from the wetlands of Doggerland. But, of course, unless we find evidence of Cursus monuments under the North Sea, we can never know this for sure. It is still more hypothesis than theory. Back to the finds from the North Sea floor, and as well as a human jawbone, there have been hundreds of other artefacts, including animal bones that show signs of butchery, and tools made from bone and antler, including an axe with a distinct zigzag pattern. Most of the finds come from close to the now lost river systems of Doggerland, which would make sense, as that is exactly where you would expect humans to settle or set up camp. Experts also excavated shallow water zones closer to mainland Europe, and back in the 1970s and 1980s, they recovered evidence of a well-advanced late Mesolithic fishing culture, with finely decorated canoe paddles and several long thin canoes, one of which was more than 30 feet in length. Doggerland really wasn't as primitive as you may think. More evidence for sophistication in ancient Britain and Doggerland is the discovery of a Mesolithic wooden platform that was found on the Isle of Wight, just off the coast of England. This has been interpreted as a boat-building site that dates back 8,000 years. The construction methods to build this platform were way more advanced than expected, and the find reinforces the idea that the people of the Mesolithic in this part of the world were far more sophisticated than we give them credit for. As well as being skilled craftsmen, Doggerlanders would have had to have been adaptable. The most rapid rises in sea level were around 3 to 6 feet a century, And at those times, in just a few generations, coastlines would have moved inland by miles. Familiar hunting grounds would have been swallowed up by water, and lakes would have turned into estuaries. People would have had to adapt to their changing environment to survive. The people of Doggerland would have had to have been skilled boat builders and fishermen, and, as stated, they would have had to have had an understanding of water management, building dikes, channels and reservoirs perhaps, especially if settlements were permanent. Skills would have had to have been passed down from generation to generation as the landmass continued to shrink in size. This knowledge would have stayed with them when the final inhabitants left and settled in Britain and mainland Europe. Those that went west towards Britain would have first seen the cliffs of Britain's northeast coast in Northumberland, and experts have found a dwelling at this location that had been rebuilt 3 times in 150 years. It dates to around 7900 BC. The fact that this building displays repeat habitation shows increased territoriality, and it's possible that the resident people were defending their land against displaced Doggerlanders, or maybe they were Doggerlanders who had resettled as close to home as possible. Either way, it proves that people were building permanent settlements as opposed to just having temporary camps. Maybe these settlements were just seasonal, or maybe they weren't, but the archaeological record for this time period is far from complete, and we can never know for sure. Throughout its relatively short history, post-Ice Age Doggerland would never have been a truly stable environment. It was a constantly evolving landscape as sea levels continually rose, but it was also heavily affected by major natural disasters. Around 6200 BC, there was a massive release of meltwater into the Atlantic from a giant glacial lake in North America, which caused sea levels to rise by more than 2 feet. The influx of cold water slowed the circulation of the warmer seas of the North Atlantic. Temperatures plunged, and experts believe that Doggerland would have been battered by ice-cold winds. At around the same time, Doggerland was also in the firing line of the Storegga Slide mega tsunami, a cataclysmic event I've discussed in previous videos. After these events, if populations were not wiped out, it is likely that this was the final straw, and many would have left for pastures new, the higher ground to the west in Britain or the south in Europe. It is also very likely that some people did stay. For many, it's human nature to stay at the place we call home, whatever the conditions may be, as we try to weather the storm. Nobody knows for sure when Doggerland disappeared in its entirety, and estimates vary between 3500 and 6000 BC. Around 4000 BC, at the advent of the Neolithic in Britain, there was an influx of people. Yes, people did come from mainland Europe, but I believe it was at this time when the last Doggerlanders left behind their shrinking island, something that today we call Dogger Bank. Modelling by some researchers agrees with this timeline. Various cultures and technologies would have mixed, and Neolithic Britain may well have been a truly multicultural society at the start of the Neolithic. Of course, Britain had its own indigenous population as well. Starcar is a Mesolithic archaeological site in Yorkshire in England. It dates to around 9000 BC, a time when Doggerland would have been a vast inhabited plain. Rare finds from this amazing archaeological site include 21 headdresses that were made from red deer skulls, 193 barbed harpoons that were used in hunting and fishing, as well as the oldest house ever discovered in Britain. Due to the exceptional preservation conditions, Starcar has given us the earliest British examples of jewellery, carpentry, and even a hunting bow was uncovered. This here is an extremely rare and ancient pendant, marked with lines and made during the Neolithic. This ancient British settlement may well give us a snapshot of what life was like on Doggerland, and far from being a temporary camp for roaming hunter-gatherers, Starcar was actually a permanent settlement that was occupied for a few hundred years. It remained important for many generations of Mesolithic families, maybe the same family, which does paint a very different picture of Mesolithic life compared to the nomadic lifestyle and temporary camps we usually think of. In the Stonehenge landscape, there are post holes that date back to around 8000 BC. These are very close to Blickmead, a chalkland spring that shows evidence of habitation that goes back to 10,000 years. This habitation was continuous until around 4000 BC, which for the Mesolithic is incredible. At the site, 35,000 work flints and 2,400 animal bones, some cooked, many of which are from aurochs, have been found at the site. Aurochs were large prehistoric cattle, and killing just one of these beasts would have provided food for 200 people. There are remains from at least 7 aurochs at Blickmead, and radiocarbon dating has shown that these animals were eaten between 6650 and 4722 BC. The spring would have made it an attractive place to camp, but it was likely a permanent settlement, and the fact there are large post holes nearby implies there were permanent structures in the landscape, which again is not what you'd expect if Britain really was just home to roaming hunter-gatherers. Evidence suggests that Blickmead was a place of large gatherings and extravagant feasts, thousands of years before the famous Stonehenge monument was even an idea. Maybe Britain and also Doggerland was a hunter-gatherer society before 4000 BC, hunting and fishing for food and gathering wild berries and nuts, but there were certainly permanent settlements and established communities. There is a real sense of an organised society. These were not primitive people, and we can safely assume that there is sufficient evidence to say that Doggerlanders were just as advanced. In fact, you could argue that the people of Doggerland were even more advanced. As stated, it was Europe's post-Ice Age Garden of Eden, a fertile savanna, and it would have been an obvious destination for migrating humans, more so than mainland Europe and Britain. Doggerland could well have been the birthplace for Neolithic society in Europe, ideas that were taken to Britain and Europe around 6,000 years ago, when Doggerland finally sank below the waves. This lost land is still the great unknown, a lost sunken world, and also the missing link in the story and development of post-Ice Age Europe. Are there memories of it in Scandinavian, British, Irish and Dutch folklore and legends? What lies below the North Sea just waiting to be discovered? Could there be a submerged Göbekli Tepe, ancient henges and Cursus monuments? The potential finds certainly make the mind wander, but for me, that's the true beauty in studying ancient lost history. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.